All right, we are finally moving into the part of the course, the part of the subject that's of most interest to most people, the aspect of life, biology. And if you look at it, I'm going to frame it in terms of ecosystems, and the definition is up there. It's the totality, it's everything encompassing the environment in which those animals and plants are living. And we have successfully covered, check, 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 the chemical, physical, and geological aspects. And now it's time to sort of add all that together to the biological. And ecosystems are that. They're everything all together. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of transfer or movement or exchange of both matter, mass, energy, and energy between these organic parts, but also the inorganic parts that we're talking about. But first, let's look at a few biological examples. And here you've got a mighty barracuda, a big predator, chomping down on some unnamed prey fish. And it's easy to visualize. You can actually see the transfer of mass from the body of one species into the body of another. But at the same time, there is a transfer of energy. Also in the ocean, my favorite organisms are snails. Anybody that knows me knows that's true. And here the energy and mass transfer is from the plant, a little frond of algae, seaweed, that this snail is calmly grazing upon. Transfer from the producer level to the first level of consumer. Here's another example. These are two different echinoderms. Echinoderms, the phylum Echinodermata comes from the word echinos, derma, two words, which literally translates from Greek as spiny skin. You can see they both have spiny skins. And what you're looking at here is a predator starfish about to eat his prey, the sea urchin. Another picture here is a crab, and the mass transfer here is from those big, scary-looking claws actually daintily snipping, processing, and moving bits of algae that you see on the ground there into the mouth of this crab. Again, one organism transferring mass into its body from another organism. And here's a final example, but this one's a little bit harder to see. In fact, you can't. The organisms that you see prominently there are big tube worms. They're worms that grow or secrete a hard calcium carbonate tube for protection. They kind of duck into it when they want to either rest or get away from predators, but when they want to feed, they squirt out of the top, they unfurl this whole array of tentacles that are then covered by cilia, and those little things are moving rapidly, and you can't see it, but they are grabbing food right now out of the water column. It's microscopic food, usually single-celled critters, smaller than a millimeter, much smaller for some of them, and that's how this transfer of energy and matter is shown. Just some visualizations as the food dynamics, and this you could call a food chain. This is sort of a primitive way of looking at the transfer of matter and energy, and we're going to emphasize first in this lecture the lower level, the primary producers. These are the plants. They're the organisms that are photosynthesizing, and they are the basis for most of the ecosystems in the oceans and in the world. And so you have plants at this first level. Diatoms, we'll talk about those later. Those are single-celled microscopic planktic plants. Those are eaten by the primary consumers, the first little things that eat them, which are then eaten by the next and by the next. And this view sort of shows it as almost a series. One thing gets eaten by another, gets eaten by another, gets eaten by another. It can be expressed in other ways. This is a food web. And notice here, instead of a one-to-one-to-one series, there are multiple organisms at each level, and there are multiple pathways of who is eating whom. if you look at it here. But again, this starts at the bottom here with diatoms and dinoflagellates, which were also single-celled plant organisms. The food pyramid, how a lot of you learned about this way back when in elementary school. And visually this is good because it shows that plants are the bottom. They're the basis. They're the foundation of these ecosystems with, again, successive levels of organisms eating each other. It also, because it has this pyramid shape, gets across the idea that there is less mass as you go upwards in each level, and there's less energy transfer as you go upward in each level. By the time you reach these tertiary carnivores, which are large things in the oceans like sharks, there's very little biomass compared to the total summed biomass of all the planktic plants in the ocean. Biomass is that quantity of living matter. I didn't put it on this slide, but I'll show you, point it out later. It is measured as grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So imagine a square meter of ocean floor, literally measuring how much grams of carbon is there, and then summing that over the year. For every level, those facts are true. You should know those things. And that's expressed again in this previous diagram much better. Another way to show it, and here the food transfer goes from left to right. The first trophic level on the extreme left, we have phytoplankton, the plants, and then notice as you go to each step, the different trophic levels, there is less energy, there's less mass, until by the time you reach these top level, trophic level 3 carnivores, there's very little. Now, we're going to emphasize the production in this lecture. The plants, the first part, the basis for all of these food systems. And these plants are going to have several factors that influence how abundant they are, how much they are, how productive they are. The two big ones being the ones in red there, the sun, solar radiation, and nutrients, the food that they're getting. But we're going to hit a couple of these other secondary factors like upwelling and then grazing intensity. And don't forget here, even though that we keep talking about energy and the sun and everything, but the actual transfer of energy from the sun to the plants is very, very small, less than 1%. You see it's very low there as they're using it to do photosynthesis. I like this diagram of ecosystems because not only does it show the levels of trophic interactions, sort of plants and animals and animals and animals, it shows them in their physical environment. The blue areas, both the light and the dark blue, represent the water. The white at the top is the atmosphere, and then the brown or tan color at the bottom is the seafloor, the sediment. And so you see here in the upper left, sunlight, solar radiation penetrating the water. That plus the nutrients in the water, that's what starts the plants growing. These plants then, either living or dead, are eaten by animals, and then that whole ecosystem functioning that we showed in the previous slides goes through. This does cycle back. As animals die, they will sink down into the water column where they will become decomposed, broken down by bacteria and other organisms. A lot of that becomes incorporated into the sediment as biogenous sediment. A lot of it gets dissolved in the solutions of the water, and then it gets mixed back up and it becomes the nutrients for this whole cycle to flourish again. Another prominent thing you see in this diagram is the separation between the upper part of the water, the photic zone, and the lower part, which they're calling the aphotic zone. And the photic zone is merely the level of the water to which solar radiation can penetrate. So the lower limit of this is the lower limit of where plants are going to get sun. Plants need sun, so this is the level where plants are going to thrive and grow. If we look at the next slide here, this sort of maps productivity over the oceans, and productivity, remember, is literally the biomass of these plants. So primary productivity is productivity of plants. There's the units measured in grams of carbon per square meter per year, and it's color-coded here with low productivity, very little, being this sort of salmon color. And notice it's in the central gyres portion of the oceans. And then on the other extreme, we have the very high productivity, and that's shown in Warhawk purple here. And notice these are hugging the coastlines, but in just a few very specific places. The west coast of the United States, South America, and then Africa, a couple places around Africa. The green area shows areas that are still productive but less than these purple areas. And notice the green areas are, well, they basically encircle the continents. And that makes sense. This productivity is pushed by the large input of nutrients from the land. So we know that there is weathering of the land. The land is constantly breaking down, and rivers are transferring those nutrients to the oceans. So there's a high amount around almost all of the land areas in the ocean. The areas in purple are different. They are ultra high because they have both the nutrients running off from the land, but they're going to have a phenomenon that we call upwelling, which we'll talk about in just a bit. Now, the players in this system, there are many other types, but the major phytoplankton are these three groups. The diatoms in the upper right, and there's a couple of examples, and they are single-celled plants. They photosynthesize, and they grow a beautiful little two-piece skeleton made of silica, SiO2. The second group are the dinoflagellates. They're the ones shown in the middle here, and they are also single-celled algal creatures, but they grow a skeleton, the sort of thing that encompasses their body, made of this organic walled material. And then finally, in the lower right, we have the coccoliths, and these have a skeleton made of calcium carbonate. When these organisms die, if they haven't been eaten, their skeletons rain down to the bottom of the ocean, and these are the things that form those biogenous oozes that become sediments, biogenous sediments that we talked about earlier in the class. Okay, so we learned about them earlier in the context of geology. Now we're going to talk about them as living organisms. The system that they're operating in, remember we're in the photic zone, and this diagram, pretty simple one, but you got to know it. Irradiance is the amount of solar radiation. It can be measured a whole bunch of ways, and it gets higher as you go towards the right. And then water depth, you get deeper as you go down in the diagram, and that's as you would expect. There's lots of solar radiation at the surface, right where the sun is hitting the surface of the water, and declines, declines, declines with depth. This takes us back to that concept of the photic zone, and again, there it is defined. It's the level to which the solar radiation penetrates, and then we sometimes divide it into two halves. The upper half is the euphotic zone. So if you imagine drawing a line sort of through the middle of this upper part, notice that the upper part receives all of the wavelengths of light, of transmitted light, but some wavelengths don't penetrate. The blues, the reds, some of the warmer colors don't go all the way down in depth, but if some do, even some of these just sort of limited transference of wavelengths, it's enough for photosynthesis for some species. This is another way to cut up the oceans, and again, this makes up less than 2% of the oceans by volume, but it is virtually the place where almost all marine life exists. Below this is the aphotic zone. Of course, this extends miles down to the deepest depths of the ocean, And these are areas where there is no photosynthesis for the plants. There might be nutrients, but there's no solar radiation. And so life is very limited here. It's organized slightly differently than what we're going to talk about now. This is just another term that some people use that study this. It's the compensation depth, and it is the depth where respiration equals photosynthesis. It's the area that encompasses the depth of greatest productivity. Let's just put it that way. And notice it lines up exactly with the bottom of the euphotic zone. Photosynthesis still occurs below that, remember, to the lower levels of the photic zone, but it is greatly, greatly reduced. Let's look at the relationship with temperature now as far as nutrients, the factor here. Several things showing here. So again, water depth is the vertical axis, and it increases as you go down. Sea surface is at the top, and the blue line is temperature. And notice at the surface, temperature is pretty consistent. It's warm. It's warmed by the sun. You reach the thermocline. We talked about the thermocline last time. That's the region in which there is a large, rapid drop in temperature. And then below that thermocline, temperature again remains stable but much colder. Nutrients. Nutrients, if you plot it through the water column, they are abundant in the upper area, but they get rapidly utilized by organisms such that they're used the most near the surface and then less so with depth, reaching down here. And then in the thermocline, they are concentrated because of physical aspects of the water, and then constant below that. Notice this weird dichotomy. Temperature is highest at the surface and low at depth. Nutrients are lower at the surface, mostly because they're rapidly utilized, but the ones that sink make the cold, deep bottom water nutrient rich, very rich. So the two aspects that are important to plants, solar radiation, one is at abundance in the shallow areas, the other, nutrients, are abundant in deeper areas. This is just a picture of those central gyre bulges. And so you can see this is the northern hemisphere. Here's the Gulf Stream, the North Atlantic, and the Canary. There's the bulge, western intensification of the thing. And look at the level of the thermocline. Notice it is also sort of deflected downward, almost at an equal amount as the bulge is deflected upward, so that this level down here means that the nutrient level is forced downward as well. We'll talk about that again later. But let's look at this map again here. This is to show, again, it's a different book, so a different image of primary production. Here, the colors are blues, types of blues and greens, and then the lighter the color, the lower the production. Again, you see in the central gyres, production is lowest, and that's because of what we just showed over here. There is this convergence of water to the center, creating the bulge, and then there is what we call a downwelling. Water with nutrients is forced downward and then out of the system. So there's less nutrients, therefore lower productivity. And then you can see the higher and higher levels of productivity with, here they don't make it as sharp, but you can see the 3 spots in Africa where there's high productivity. And here they kind of extend the upwelling high productivity area all the way from South America to Central America up to North America. So this is a global verification of this phenomenon of low productivity from the gyres. The highest, again, are present where there is runoff from land, plus the phenomenon of upwelling, which Again, we're kind of sort of hammering home here with each of these slides. How does upwelling occur? Well, let's look at the Southern California example. The blue is the Pacific Ocean. The tan is Southern California. The prevailing winds are shown as this bluish arrow. Remember, there is this deflection towards the right. So the winds blow this way. Water is deflected to the right, which means away from the shore. If water is pulled away from the shore, because sea level stays level, it gets replaced by water from depth, upwelling. And so Southern California, sunny place, but it also has this upwelling of nutrients, which means a double positive as far as feeding and starting the photosynthetic primary productivity. A picture shown, a satellite image with false color enhancement. The warmer the color, the more primary productivity. And so hugging right along the coastline, you see these warmest colors here. Notice also, though, there's this weird phenomenon of increased productivity. Look at this long finger here, this equatorial increase in primary productivity. And this is also due to upwelling, but a different kind, and here it's due to movement of currents. We learned before about the equatorial currents in the northern hemisphere. They make this big clockwise gyre. In the southern hemisphere, they make this big counterclockwise gyre. Where they sort of meet, the two gyres, is this zone of divergence. There's the motion of the currents. Notice the deflection of water because of Ekman transport away from it. So water's pulled away from this central area, but again, for sea level to remain level, water gets replenished there by upwelling from the deep. Again, delivering nutrients for us. And again, a satellite image. Again, what's shown in the colors here is chlorophyll concentration. Another way of saying that increased productivity, and you can see this prominent linear feature along the equatorial area where upwelling has occurred, productivity has increased. Lots of things to see in this next slide. So we've got, they divide up the ocean areas into three particular places. The Oceanic, think of that as the open ocean gyre type area. The coastal area, near the coasts where nutrients are abundant, and then upwelling areas, which are also usually near the coast. I just showed you a different example though, but near the coast, but also with this extra injection of nutrients. Primary production, grams of carbon per meter squared per year. Notice it's lowest in these low productivity dead zones, the central parts of gyres, higher in coastal areas, but highest in areas of upwelling. This is the reverse, though, of the areas of the ocean where which are covered by the area. There are vast areas that are encompassed by these gyres, less so for coastal areas and even less so for the upwelling areas. If you then take the amount of primary productivity, multiply it or factor in the area that's involved, and just sum the total primary production over a year, so the tons of carbon, the open oceans still produce most of the primary productivity. It's just so spread out that it's the basis of ecosystems, but not large ones, not ones that are filled with species, high biomass this way. So total primary productivity is actually lowest in the upwelling areas, but the fish production there is highest, even though it's the smallest area, smallest total productivity. But looky here, there is far less loss or transfer of energy as you go, because these open ocean systems have many more trophic steps. Down here, you have productivity, something eats that, something eats the next organism. Boom. And that's what we fish for. And so our total fish production, most of our fish production, comes from upwelling areas and coastal areas, with very little, in fact, from these open ocean areas, even though they, if you sum the amount of productivity there, it is the greatest amount. If we look now at what the zooplankton are, what is eating or processing, rapidly processing this primary production. So the first level of heterotrophs are a whole suite of things like what you see here. The prominent, probably the most abundant one, are the one, this thing in the bottom here, this little shrimpy critter, this euphausid. But notice they're all small. The scale bar here is 0.5 millimeters. Dinky little things. But these are these first level consumers which are gobbling up those planktic plants, the primary productivity. These then are eaten by successively larger and larger creatures as part of the food ecosystem. Let's look at a few maps. Here again, primary productivity. So this is phytoplankton abundance in grams of carbon per square meter per year. This then shows zooplankton biomass. So if we then measure the level of biomass of these creatures here, these primary consumers, notice it pretty much mirrors the phytoplankton. I mean, their lives are dependent upon it, so areas that are low in primary productivity are low for zooplankton biomass. Areas that are high, same thing. So that kind of makes sense. And then I like this diagram here. This kind of shows three things. So biomass, again, in whatever units you want to measure. The net primary production is shown in blue. So here's February, March, April. So here's that spring increase in primary productivity in those temperate areas. It starts climbing, 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 which causes an explosion, a population explosion of that zooplankton, which then gobble up almost all of it. So notice the amount that's actually grazed by herbivores, it mirrors this increase beautifully, meaning both of those are eaten down. And if you take the amount of the blue line, subtract the amount of the red line that's dissolved, eaten, taken away, what you're left with is the standing crop, and notice it's pretty low throughout. Almost all of the primary productivity gets gobbled up by those zooplankton as it's produced. We can then talk about what's called the turnover time, and you can calculate it out, but we're not going to do it here. But if you look at it as dividing the amount of new primary or standing crop by the new biomass, the new primary producer biomass, you get this notion of turnover time. The greater the fraction of the biomass that is new biomass, then the faster this ecosystem is turning over, renewing itself. One way to look at this is any plants that are produced over this course of time are eaten up. They're gone. They're taken out of the system completely. That's going to be very different versus the land. Now think about this. Look over here at turnover time. This is marine versus land. Marine years, notice 0.02, 0.06. The turnover time in the oceans is very, very, very rapid. Plants are produced because they're planktic plants. They are rapidly gobbled up and they're out of the system. Look at turnover time for land plants. 9 to 20 years. Many, many orders of magnitude more. And think about it, this is because we have plants like giant oak trees and pines and sequoias and things. We have some plants that they're sitting there uneaten for centuries, many, many decades. If you then sum that with grasses, grasses might be more like the turnover time of the oceans, but even there they last longer. So a field of grass grows and it exists longer before it's grazed down or used than its equivalent in the oceans, the plankton. If you then look at the total biomass in the oceans, 1 to 2 billion tons versus the huge 600 to 1,000 billion tons in the oceans, and then the net primary productivity, look at this. This is pretty much the similar. Oceans, land, similar amounts of productivity. The total biomass, though, is much, much lower because all of this productivity in the oceans is gobbled up, and that's reflected in this turnover time. On land, here's this net primary productivity each year, but the standing crop is much, much larger, so the turnover time is very long still. If we then look at this as primary productivity, oceans versus land, sort of similar areas, areas that are supposed to be analogous, desert areas where we know there aren't very many plants, there's not much life, their equivalent is really those open oceans center of the gyre areas. That's where there are similar levels of primary productivity. Terrestrial areas like forests, grasslands, croplands, we associate those with high levels of productivity, which would be like the continental shelves as far as the oceans are concerned. Then if you think about pastures, rainforests, lakes, croplands, higher still, those are like our upwelling areas in the oceans. And then highest, swamplands, intensively developed agricultural areas. This is human forcing of high productivity, and that's equal to the very shallow estuaries, lots and lots of nutrients, lots and lots of solar radiation, and coral reefs of the ocean. So this is a good chart comparing productivity and sort of analogous areas in land. How does this then affect the biomass of larger creatures? So benthic creatures are those creatures that live either on or in the sea floor. So here's a whole array of creatures like this, sort of mussels, crabs, barnacles, sea anemones, snails, etc. These things are bigger than the zooplankton, but a lot of them eat the zooplankton, or they eat the things that eat the zooplankton. Increased primary productivity leads to an increase of zooplankton productivity, which leads to an increase of biomass of all of these things. If you then map again, the biomass of the benthos, those are all those creatures living on the bottom. Again, this is reflected in the similar chart. Low levels in the oceans, higher in the coastal areas, and if you were to separate it out, it's highest still in these areas where there is active upwelling. So, primary productivity is extremely important in the oceans because it forms the base, the starting point of all of these food chains, food webs, food ecosystems, which allow for increase of zooplankton and increase of benthic creatures. It's different in the oceans, mostly because of the huge turnover time that's involved with the plankton being produced, gobbled up. The turnover is much, much faster. So we can talk about terrestrial or land ecology versus marine ecology, and there are similarities, but there's this very distinct difference that goes back to this huge difference in turnover time.